Sometimes the smallest purchase becomes the biggest mistake the proudest person ever makes. The auction room smelled faintly of old paper, fresh coffee, and polished hardwood as investors chatted with quiet confidence, waiting for another forgotten property to disappear beneath another winning bid. Nobody paid much attention to the weathered brick garage listed near the end of the catalog. The roof sagged slightly. The faded metal doors barely closed. Broken windows reflected the pale autumn sunlight like tired eyes that had watched too many dreams fade away. It had once been part of a thriving neighborhood auto district, but years of neglect had turned it into little more than an overlooked storage building that most developers considered a demolition project. Claire Whitmore, the elegant CEO of Whitmore Development, barely glanced at the listing before setting the folder aside. To her, it was nothing more than another liability waiting to be cleared from the balance sheet. Her company specialized in transforming forgotten neighborhoods into modern commercial centers, and sentiment had never appeared on a financial report. Across the room, however, sat a man who saw something entirely different. Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his worn denim shirt as he quietly held a cashier's check inside rough hands marked by years of honest work. Every dollar represented skipped meals, late nights repairing pickup trucks, and weekends spent fixing lawn mowers for neighbors who could barely afford to pay him. Beside him sat his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, hugging a small notebook decorated with hand-drawn cars and smiling garages. She looked around the crowded room with innocent curiosity while her father remained perfectly still, almost invisible among wealthy investors dressed in tailored suits. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He wasn't there to compete with millionaires. He was simply chasing one impossible dream. When the auctioneer finally announced the garage, a few quiet chuckles floated across the room. Someone whispered that the building should have been bulldozed years ago. Another joked that even raccoons deserved better real estate. Claire smiled politely, already preparing to move on to the next property. Then a calm voice interrupted the laughter. $1,000. Every head turned. Ethan slowly lowered his bidding card without changing his expression. The room grew strangely quiet before another wave of amused laughter rolled across the audience. Claire studied him for the first time. He looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Just another struggling father making an emotional decision instead of a smart investment. She leaned toward her attorney and quietly said, "If that's what he wants, let him have it." The gavel struck once. Sold. Ethan exhaled softly, as though the sound itself carried 6 years of hope. Lily squeezed his arm with both hands and whispered, "Daddy, does this mean we finally have our own garage?" He smiled with tired eyes that still carried something money could never purchase. "Not yet," he answered gently. "Today we only bought a building. Tomorrow we'll have to earn everything else." Claire watched them leave through the tall glass doors, convinced she had just witnessed another man buying himself an expensive disappointment. She had no idea that 6 months later she would stand on the same street, staring at that forgotten garage in complete silence, wondering how the smallest deal of her career had quietly become the greatest mistake of her life. Ethan barely slept that night. Long after Lily had fallen asleep beneath her faded blue quilt, he sat alone at the tiny kitchen table with the worn envelope that now held the deed to the garage. The old ceiling fan turned slowly above him, filling the quiet apartment with its familiar clicking rhythm. Bills were stacked neatly beside a half-finished cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The pickup truck needed new brakes. Winter would arrive before long. Logic insisted that spending every dollar he had on a crumbling building had been irresponsible. But somewhere beneath the fear lived a quiet conviction that refused to disappear. The next morning, Ethan parked his aging pickup in front of the property just after sunrise. The neighborhood was still waking up. A bakery down the block filled the crisp air with the smell of fresh bread while distant traffic rolled through the streets like a steady river. Lily climbed out carrying a small toolbox almost too heavy for her. She looked at the faded brick walls and crooked metal doors without disappointment. Children often saw possibilities long before adults did. "It is bigger than I imagined," she whispered with a smile. Ethan unlocked the rusted chain and slowly pushed open the doors. Dust floated through the pale morning light. Broken shelves leaned against cracked walls. An old workbench sat buried beneath years of forgotten junk. Rainwater stains stretched across the ceiling, and one corner of the concrete floor had begun to crumble. Most people would have seen a building beyond saving. Ethan quietly walked from one wall to another, touching the old brick with the palm of his hand as though greeting an old friend. "This place still has good bones," he said softly. Lily looked around with bright eyes. "Where will the customers wait?" Ethan smiled. "Right over there by the front window." "Where will you fix engines?" she asked. "Back here where the light is strongest." "And where will I do my homework?" He laughed for the first time in days. "You get the best spot in the whole garage." She pointed toward a dusty corner beside the window. "That one." Ethan nodded. "That one." They spent the rest of the morning carrying out broken boards, rusted pipes, cracked tires, and boxes nobody had touched in years. Every piece of trash removed revealed another small piece of hope. Around noon, an elderly man walking his golden retriever paused outside the open doors. He studied the garage for a moment before shaking his head kindly. "You bought this place?" Ethan looked up from his broom. "Yes, sir." The man smiled with sympathy more than confidence. "You have got yourself a mountain of work," Ethan simply answered. "One shovel at a time." The man tipped his cap and continued down the sidewalk. By late afternoon, sweat covered Ethan's shirt, his hands ached, and only a small section of the garage looked different. Yet somehow the room already felt alive. The sunlight reached farther inside now that years of clutter had disappeared. Lily sat at the old workbench coloring a picture of a bright red pickup parked beneath a shiny new sign. Across the top she carefully printed 3 simple words in blue marker. Brooks Family Garage. Ethan stopped sweeping when he saw the drawing. He did not say anything. He simply looked at it for several quiet seconds before folding it carefully and slipping it into his shirt pocket. Sometimes the first brick of an empire is not made of concrete. Sometimes it is made of hope that refuses to quit. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm measured not by calendars but by sunrise and honest effort. Every morning Ethan unlocked the garage before the first commuters filled the streets, and every evening he locked it long after the neighborhood lights began to glow. He could not afford contractors, so he became the contractor. He learned roofing techniques from library books, watched old repair demonstrations on a borrowed laptop, and accepted advice from retired mechanics who wandered in simply because they admired someone willing to work with quiet determination. Every dollar that came in went directly back into the building. Fresh paint replaced faded walls. Salvaged cabinets became organized tool stations. An old soda machine was cleaned until it looked welcoming again. Nothing matched perfectly, yet everything reflected care. Lily became the smallest member of the crew. After school she swept the floors, arranged waiting room magazines, and placed a handwritten welcome sign beside the front door every morning. One afternoon she asked, "Daddy, when will people know we are here?" Ethan tightened a bolt on an old hydraulic lift before answering. "One customer at a time." She tilted her head. "Is that enough?" He smiled without looking up. "It has always been enough." Their first paying customer arrived almost by accident. A middle-aged delivery driver noticed the open garage while searching for someone willing to replace a worn alternator before the next morning. Larger repair shops had quoted several days of waiting. Ethan listened carefully instead of rushing the conversation. He explained every repair, showed the old parts after the job was finished, and charged exactly what he had promised. As the driver prepared to leave, he paused beside his truck. "Most places fix the vehicle," he said. "You treated me like I mattered." Ethan simply nodded. "Safe travels." 2 days later another customer arrived because of that recommendation. Then another. A retired schoolteacher needed brake work. A young nurse asked for help with a noisy engine before a weekend shift. A landscaper stopped by after hearing there was an honest mechanic who never pressured anyone into unnecessary repairs. Slowly, the empty parking spaces outside began to disappear. Inside Whitmore Development Headquarters, Claire hardly remembered the little garage she had sold. Her days were consumed by board meetings, investment presentations, and architectural renderings spread across polished conference tables. During one meeting, an assistant mentioned that several nearby businesses were seeing unexpected growth in the old district. Claire glanced briefly at the report before sliding it aside. "Interesting," she said calmly. "We will review the area after the next quarter." Her attention quickly returned to projects worth millions. She never imagined that the smallest property she had ever approved would quietly become the heartbeat of that neighborhood. Back at the garage, the sound of laughter had begun replacing the silence that once filled the dusty building. Customers stayed longer than necessary, sharing coffee, trading stories, and introducing friends. Ethan never advertised with billboards or expensive campaigns. He remembered every name, every family, and every promise he made. By the end of the second month, the waiting calendar hanging behind the counter was nearly full. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the concrete floor, Lily carefully unfolded the drawing she had made weeks earlier. She looked at the crowded parking lot through the front window, smiled at her father, and quietly whispered, "Daddy, I think people finally found us." Ethan looked outside, then back at the little sketch in her hands. Without realizing it, they had already begun building something far greater than a repair shop. They were earning trust, and trust has a remarkable way of growing faster than anyone expects. By the beginning of the fourth month, the garage no longer woke up with silence. It woke up with purpose. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the waiting area every morning, blending with the familiar scent of clean metal and motor oil. Sunlight poured through the front windows that Ethan had repaired with his own hands, casting warm reflections across polished concrete floors that had once been buried beneath dust and broken boards. The little building that many people had dismissed as worthless now felt welcoming before a single wrench had even been lifted. Customers noticed the difference the moment they stepped inside. They were greeted by name whenever possible. They were offered honest explanations instead of confusing technical language. If a repair could wait another month without risking safety, Ethan told them so. If a used part could save a struggling family hundreds of dollars while remaining reliable, he recommended it without hesitation. Profit mattered because bills had to be paid, but character mattered even more. One chilly morning, a young college student named Tyler rolled into the lot driving an aging sedan that rattled with every turn. His face carried the quiet worry of someone balancing tuition, rent, and 2 part-time jobs. After a careful inspection, Ethan realized the repair would cost less than the chain repair shop had quoted. Tyler looked down at the estimate and admitted he could only afford about half. Ethan remained silent for a moment before saying, "Pay what you can today. Finish the rest when life gives you some breathing room." Tyler stared at him in disbelief. "You trust me?" Ethan smiled gently. "Everyone needs someone to believe in them at least once." 2 weeks later, Tyler returned, not only with the remaining balance but with homemade cookies baked by his grandmother. He also brought 2 classmates whose cars needed maintenance. Word traveled through families, churches, schools, and neighborhood gatherings faster than any advertisement ever could. Lily noticed something else changing. The waiting room had become a place where strangers talked to one another instead of staring at their phones. An elderly widow shared stories with a young firefighter while waiting for oil changes. A nurse exchanged recipes with a retired carpenter. Children colored pictures at the small table Ethan had built from reclaimed wood. It no longer felt like a business alone. It felt like a community finding its way back together. One Friday afternoon, a retired mechanic named Walter stopped by carrying a faded red toolbox that had followed him through more than 40 years of work. He watched Ethan finish a repair before quietly placing the toolbox on the counter. "I cannot crawl under cars the way I used to," Walter said with a warm smile. "But I can still teach. If you ever need another pair of experienced hands, I would rather spend my mornings here than sitting in front of a television." Ethan accepted the offer with genuine gratitude. Soon Walter began mentoring teenagers who wanted to learn honest craftsmanship after school. The little garage started creating opportunities no spreadsheet could ever measure. Across town, an analyst at Whitmore Development prepared another quarterly report. One paragraph mentioned unexpected economic activity in the old district, noting that nearby small businesses were reporting increased customer traffic. Claire skimmed the document with polite curiosity before moving on to larger investment summaries. She still believed meaningful success was built through major acquisitions and billion-dollar developments. She had no idea that every simple act of kindness taking place inside one modest garage was quietly creating something that even the most sophisticated business strategy could never manufacture: unwavering trust. 6 months passed more quietly than anyone outside the neighborhood realized. The seasons changed. The maple trees lining the sidewalks traded bright green leaves for shades of gold, and every week another small improvement appeared inside the garage. A second service bay opened after Ethan purchased a used vehicle lift from a shop that had closed across town. Walter continued teaching young apprentices who arrived eager to learn not only how to repair engines but also how to shake a customer's hand with respect and look them in the eye when giving their word. Lily had grown comfortable sitting at the front desk after school, greeting visitors with the same warm smile her father offered everyone who walked through the door. Many customers joked that she was the real manager. She laughed every time but secretly loved hearing it. One crisp October morning, Claire climbed into the back seat of a company sedan as her assistant reviewed properties scheduled for an upcoming redevelopment study. Several blocks in the old district had experienced unexpected commercial growth, enough to attract renewed attention from investors. Claire agreed to drive through the area before returning downtown. She expected to find a few renovated storefronts and perhaps another coffee shop. Instead, traffic slowed nearly half a block before the intersection where the forgotten garage once stood. She looked out the window with mild curiosity. Cars filled every parking space. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the street. Customers stood outside talking with steaming cups of coffee while children laughed near flower boxes that decorated the entrance. The weathered building she remembered had disappeared beneath fresh brickwork, clean blue trim, polished windows, and a handcrafted wooden sign that read Brooks Family Garage. Claire leaned forward. "Stop here," she said quietly. The driver pulled to the curb. For a long moment she remained seated without speaking. She recognized the address immediately, but nothing else seemed familiar. Through the open service doors she watched mechanics working with calm confidence instead of hurried chaos. Every workstation was spotless. Every employee appeared focused. No one shouted. No one rushed. Customers waited patiently because they trusted the people inside. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk. The autumn air carried the comforting scent of coffee, fresh paint, and clean motor oil. She noticed a retired couple laughing with a young family near the entrance while an apprentice carefully explained a repair estimate to another customer. There was no expensive showroom, no luxury furniture, no elaborate marketing displays. Yet the place felt richer than many multimillion-dollar facilities she had visited. Then she saw Ethan. He was helping an elderly woman load groceries into the trunk of her sedan after repairing a loose battery cable. When she reached for her wallet again, he gently shook his head. "You already paid exactly what was fair," he said with an easy smile. "Save the rest for something you enjoy." The woman thanked him with tears in her eyes before driving away. Claire stood perfectly still. She remembered the quiet man who had raised a bidding card 6 months earlier while strangers laughed at his decision. She had believed she was handing him an expensive burden. Instead, she was watching a thriving business that seemed to breathe life into an entire neighborhood. As Ethan turned toward the office, his eyes briefly met Claire's across the busy parking lot. He smiled politely, unaware that the woman standing there was silently questioning every assumption she had made about success. Claire returned to her office carrying an unfamiliar feeling that no quarterly report had ever given her. It was not regret exactly. It was curiosity. The image of that once-forgotten garage lingered in her thoughts throughout the afternoon as executives discussed acquisition strategies and projected revenues across polished conference tables. Their conversations sounded strangely distant. Numbers filled the presentation screens, yet her mind kept returning to a father in a denim shirt who had transformed an abandoned building without expensive consultants, venture capital, or corporate branding. After the meeting ended, Claire asked her chief financial analyst to gather every publicly available record connected to Brooks' family garage. The request surprised him. Compared to the billion-dollar developments occupying the company's attention, the small repair shop barely registered as a footnote. Still, by the following morning a modest file rested neatly on Claire's desk. She opened it expecting to discover private investors, government grants, or hidden partnerships. Instead, she found something almost impossible to believe. There were no venture capital firms. There were no commercial loans beyond a modest equipment payment that Ethan had nearly finished repaying. There were no expensive advertising contracts. Tax filings showed steady but honest growth. Customer reviews filled page after page with remarkably similar comments. Honest. Fair. Trustworthy. Treated me like family. Fixed only what needed fixing. Claire leaned back in silence. She had spent years studying business expansion models, yet this success seemed to follow an entirely different formula. Later that afternoon, she asked one of her property managers to visit the neighborhood as an ordinary customer. The manager returned the next day carrying a detailed report, but the words that caught Claire's attention were not about revenue. They described something much harder to measure. Customers willingly waited several days because they trusted Ethan more than shops that could service them immediately. Local businesses reported increased foot traffic since the garage reopened. Nearby cafes sold more coffee each morning because customers stopped there while waiting for appointments. A struggling flower shop across the street had doubled its weekend sales after Lily began buying small bouquets to decorate the waiting room. Even property owners in surrounding blocks reported renewed interest from families considering the neighborhood again. Claire slowly closed the folder. One honest business had quietly strengthened an entire community without announcing a grand vision or launching a publicity campaign. The discovery unsettled her in the best possible way. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware that anyone was studying his success. His attention stayed focused on ordinary moments that rarely appeared in financial statements. He spent an afternoon helping Walter install brighter lights above the training area for the apprentices. He celebrated when Tyler, the college student he had trusted months earlier, proudly accepted his first engineering internship. He watched Lily carefully tape fresh drawings onto the waiting room wall, replacing older pictures with new dreams of classic trucks, smiling families, and bright blue skies. That evening, as they closed the garage together, Lily looked up at her father and asked, "Do you think we are successful now?" Ethan locked the front door before answering. He looked through the window at the clean shop, the neatly arranged tools, and the chairs where neighbors had spent another day talking like old friends. Then he smiled gently. "Success is when people leave here with more hope than they had when they arrived." Across the city, Claire stared once more at the file resting on her desk. For the first time in her career, she realized that the strongest foundation for any lasting empire might never be concrete or steel. It might simply be the quiet reputation of a person who always keeps his word. The quiet success of the garage did not go unnoticed forever. Where honest work creates hope, opportunity often follows, and so does competition. Early one Monday morning, a polished black sport utility vehicle stopped across the street. Two sharply dressed representatives from a national automotive service chain stepped out carrying leather portfolios instead of toolboxes. They spent nearly an hour observing the steady flow of customers before finally introducing themselves to Ethan. Their smiles were confident, their voices smooth, and their proposals sounded generous. They explained that their corporation wanted to purchase the property, keep Ethan employed as regional operations manager, and transform the neighborhood location into the flagship branch for a rapidly expanding franchise. The offer was far beyond anything Ethan had ever imagined earning in a single transaction. One representative slid a folder across the counter and quietly said, "You have already proven you can build something special. Imagine what you could do with unlimited corporate resources." Ethan thanked them for their time and promised to review the documents. That evening, after the last customer had gone home, he sat alone inside the office studying page after page while rain tapped softly against the windows. Lily finished her homework nearby before noticing the thoughtful look on his face. Is something wrong? She asked gently. Ethan smiled reassuringly. Nothing is wrong. Someone wants to buy the garage. Her pencil stopped moving. Would we have to leave? He looked around the room that had slowly become a second home for so many people. Walter was still teaching apprentices in the back. The coffee pot had become a gathering place for neighbors. Families trusted this little building with more than their vehicles. They trusted it with pieces of their lives. Ethan finally answered, I do not know yet. The following morning he invited Walter to read the proposal. The older mechanic adjusted his glasses and quietly turned each page before placing the folder back on the desk. It is a fine offer, Walter admitted. But they are buying more than a building. They are buying the heart you spent months creating. Ethan remained silent. Walter smiled kindly. Money can replace equipment. It cannot replace trust. Across town, Claire received unexpected news during another development briefing. One of her directors mentioned that the national chain had begun purchasing strategic properties throughout the district, including several surrounding Ethan's garage. Their long-term goal appeared obvious. Control the neighborhood, consolidate local businesses, and dominate the market. Claire felt an unfamiliar sense of concern. She remembered every customer review she had read, every story about the apprentices, every neighbor whose business had quietly flourished because of that single garage. If another corporation replaced it with a standardized operation, something valuable would disappear even if the new building looked more impressive. Without announcing her intentions, Claire drove back to the neighborhood later that afternoon. She parked a short distance away and watched customers arriving one after another. A retired veteran shook Ethan's hand with genuine gratitude. A young mother thanked Lily for entertaining her son while repairs were completed. Walter laughed with two teenagers as they successfully diagnosed an engine problem together. Nothing about the scene resembled an ordinary repair shop anymore. It looked like a place where people belong. Claire remained inside her car longer than she expected. For years she had measured success by acquisitions, expansion, and market share. Yet, as she watched the quiet rhythm unfolding before her eyes, another truth slowly settled into her heart. Some places become valuable not because of what stands on the land, but because of the people who gather there, and once that kind of value is lost, no amount of money can ever truly buy it back. The following afternoon Claire walked through the front door alone, dressed simply enough that no one immediately recognized the chief executive whose signature had once transferred ownership of the building. The familiar chime above the entrance rang softly as customers continued their conversations without interruption. Lily looked up from the reception desk with a bright smile. Welcome. My dad will be with you in just a minute. Claire thanked her and quietly took a seat beneath the framed drawings that covered one wall. She studied each picture carefully. Some had been colored by neighborhood children. Others showed classic pickup trucks, smiling families, and handwritten messages thanking the garage for helping someone get home safely. None of the decorations had been chosen by a marketing team. They had been given freely by grateful people. Ethan stepped out from the service bay wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. He recognized Claire immediately, though his expression never changed. Instead, he walked over with the same calm courtesy he offered everyone else. Good afternoon, he said warmly. How can I help you today? Claire looked around the busy room before answering. I actually came to speak with you. Ethan invited her into the small office near the back where sunlight filtered through newly cleaned windows onto the same old desk he had restored months earlier. The room remained simple. A coffee mug, a repair schedule, Lily's latest drawing, and a family photograph sat neatly arranged beside a stack of invoices. Claire smiled faintly. You have changed this place more than I imagined possible. Ethan glanced toward the service bays where laughter drifted in from Walter and the apprentices. A lot of people changed it, he replied. Claire folded her hands for a moment before speaking again. I owe you an apology. Ethan listened without interruption. The day I sold you this property, she continued quietly, I believed I was watching a desperate father make an emotional mistake. I thought the building would become another abandoned investment within a few months. I judged you before I knew anything about you." Silence settled gently between them. It was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Finally, Ethan smiled with the same quiet kindness that had become the heart of the garage. "Most people only saw the broken roof," he said. "I understand." Claire shook her head softly. "No. I saw less than that. I saw only the price. You saw the possibilities." Ethan looked toward Lily through the office window as she helped an elderly customer complete paperwork. "Buildings can always be repaired," he answered. "It is much harder to repair the way people see one another." His words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment. In boardrooms she was accustomed to defending every decision with confidence. Here she found herself simply listening. "A national company wants to buy this place," she said. "I know." Ethan nodded calmly. "They made a generous offer. Are you going to accept it?" she asked. Ethan looked around the office one more time before answering. "If I sell this building, I can replace walls, tools, and equipment somewhere else. But I cannot promise that all of these people would find one another again. Some things become valuable because they create belonging." Claire felt her throat tighten as she absorbed the quiet truth of those words. For the first time in many years, she realized that leadership was not measured by the size of a company or the height of a skyline. Sometimes it was measured by the number of lives that felt a little lighter after walking through one ordinary door. The answer came a week later. Ethan politely declined the corporation's offer, thanking them for recognizing the value of the garage but explaining that some dreams were never meant to become corporate assets. News of his decision spread through the neighborhood far more quickly than he expected. Customers smiled a little brighter when they walked through the front door. Walter quietly nodded as though he had known the answer all along. Lily wrapped her arms around her father before school one morning and whispered, "I am glad we are staying home." Ethan kissed the top of her head and simply replied, "So am I." Not long afterward, Claire requested one final meeting, this time carrying no contracts for purchase and no proposals for acquisition. She arrived with a single folder and placed it gently on Ethan's desk. "This is not an offer to buy your business," she said with a calm smile. "It is an invitation to protect what you have built." Inside the folder were plans for a neighborhood revitalization partnership funded by Whitmore Development. The proposal included improved sidewalks, upgraded street lighting, new landscaping, and small business improvement grants for locally owned shops throughout the district. Brooks' family garage would remain completely independent. Ethan would retain full ownership. Claire asked for nothing in return except permission to support the community that had quietly inspired her to rethink the meaning of success. Ethan looked through the pages carefully before lifting his eyes. "Why would you do this?" Claire answered with complete honesty. "Because 6 months ago I sold you a building. I thought I understood value. You showed me that value is created long after the paperwork is signed." Ethan extended his hand across the desk. Claire accepted it with quiet gratitude. Neither of them felt the need for a grand speech. Respect had already said everything words could not. Over the following months, the neighborhood continued changing in ways that no market forecast could fully explain. Empty storefronts welcomed family-owned bakeries, bookstores, and cafes. The flower shop across the street expanded into the neighboring space. Walter's apprentice program became so successful that local high schools began recommending students interested in skilled trades. Several of those young mechanics eventually earned full-time positions at the garage, while others opened honest repair shops of their own in nearby towns, carrying Ethan's values wherever they went. On a bright spring afternoon, the community gathered outside as a new wooden sign was carefully lifted above the entrance. It did not announce a franchise or a corporation. It simply read Brooks Family Garage with one smaller line beneath it that made everyone smile. Built on trust. Lily stepped back to admire the finished sign before slipping her hand into her father's. Claire stood quietly among the crowd, applauding with everyone else instead of standing apart as an executive. She no longer measured the neighborhood by property values alone. She measured it by the laughter echoing along the sidewalks, the conversations between neighbors, and the confidence returning to faces that had once carried only uncertainty. As the golden evening light settled across the brick walls, Ethan looked around at the people filling the parking lot and realized something remarkable. The old garage had never truly become an empire because of money, size, or recognition. It had become an empire because kindness multiplied, integrity endured, and quiet dignity inspired others to build something lasting together. Sometimes the greatest success in life begins with the smallest opportunity, nurtured by honest hands and a heart that never forgets the value of people.